The late evening had settled over Central Park in New York City, casting a quiet hush over the sprawling urban oasis. Braylen, a billionaire whose name frequently graced the pages of Forbes, walked along the deserted gravel paths, savoring the rare stillness that enveloped the park. His polished shoes crunched softly against the small stones, each step echoing faintly in the cool autumn air. The flickering glow of old-fashioned street lamps painted long, wavering shadows across the ground, stretching and twisting as he moved. Braylen had always found solace in these solitary walks, a ritual carved out of his tightly scheduled life. It was a time when he could silence his phone, disconnect from the relentless demands of boardrooms and stock markets, and let the world shrink to the rhythm of his own thoughts. The park, with its towering trees and winding trails, offered a refuge from the chaos of his empire, a place where he could exist without the weight of his name. On this particular evening, however, the familiar tranquility was disrupted. As Braylen rounded a gentle curve in the path, his eyes caught a figure seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak. The tree's gnarled limbs stretched overhead, partially obscuring the dim light of the nearest lamp, casting the bench in a patchwork of shadow and faint illumination. The figure was a young woman, her posture tense and hunched, as though she were trying to make herself smaller, invisible to the world. Her bare feet rested on the cold, damp earth, toes curled slightly against the chill. She wore a thin, faded jacket, its fabric frayed at the cuffs and stretched taut over her visibly pregnant belly. The curve of her abdomen was unmistakable, a silent testament to the life she carried. Her hands, clutching the edge of the jacket, trembled faintly, betraying a nervousness that seemed to radiate from her entire being. Braylen slowed his pace, his footsteps faltering as he took in the scene. The woman's face was partially obscured by a cascade of dark hair that fell in uneven strands across her shoulders. But her eyes, wide, darting, and filled with a raw, unspoken fear, caught the dim light in a way that held his attention. Her gaze flickered restlessly, scanning the empty paths and the shadowed edges of the park, as if she expected someone or something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. There was a quiet intensity to her, a sense of urgency that hung in the air like a held breath. She did not look up as Braylen approached, did not acknowledge his presence with even the slightest movement. Yet her stillness felt deliberate, as though any sudden motion might shatter her fragile composure. The billionaire was not a man prone to sentimentality. His life had been built on calculated decisions, on weighing risks and rewards with a precision that had earned him his fortune. Strangers and their troubles rarely pierced the carefully constructed walls of his world. Yet something about this woman, her vulnerability, her silent refusal to ask for help, stirred an unfamiliar instinct within him. She did not extend a hand, did not call out, did not even meet his gaze, but the weight of her presence was impossible to ignore. Her trembling shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her jacket, the stark contrast between her bare feet and the biting October air, all of it spoke of a story she was not ready to share. Braylen's first impulse was to keep walking, to let the moment pass as he had done countless times before with the city's countless strangers. But his feet remained rooted to the ground, as though some unseen force tethered him to the spot. The park around them seemed to grow quieter, the distant hum of the city fading into a faint murmur. A cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead, sending a few spiraling down to the ground near the bench. Braylen noticed the woman's lack of belongings. No bag, no coat, no shoes beyond the thin soles of her feet. She was utterly alone, stripped of the basic trappings of security, yet she sat with a kind of defiant resolve, her chin slightly raised despite the fear in her eyes. He wondered briefly what could have brought her to this moment, to this bench in the middle of a deserted park. But the questions felt intrusive, almost irrelevant in the face of her obvious distress. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, as though the night itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. Braylen's mind raced, weighing his options. He could walk away, return to his penthouse and his neatly ordered life, leaving her to whatever fate awaited. Or he could step closer, cross the invisible line that separated his world from hers, and offer something. Though what? He wasn't sure. practical side of him argued for distance. Involvement meant complications, and complications were something he had spent his life avoiding. Yet the image of her bare feet against the cold ground lingered in his mind, a detail that refused to be dismissed. Her fear was palpable, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and pervasive, like a current running beneath the surface of her silence. It was not his responsibility, he told himself. Yet the thought of leaving her there, alone and exposed, felt like a betrayal of something he could not quite name. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, though only a minute or two had passed. The woman shifted slightly, her hands tightening on her jacket as a shiver ran through her. The movement broke the spell, pulling Braylen out of his indecision. He took a cautious step forward, his shadow falling across the bench, but he stopped short of speaking. Her eyes flicked toward him for the briefest moment, then darted away, returning to their restless vigil over the park. There was no invitation in her glance, no plea, but there was something else. A spark of defiance, a refusal to crumble despite the weight of whatever she carried. Braylen felt it then, a quiet certainty that walking away was not an option. Not tonight. Not with her. The park, the city, the world itself seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, strangers bound by a moment that neither could fully understand. Braylen's life had always been a carefully orchestrated symphony of control, where every decision was measured against the scales of profit and pragmatism. He had built his empire on the foundation of detachment, keeping the messy intricacies of other people's lives at arm's length. Yet, as he stood before the young woman in Central Park, her trembling form and haunted eyes had pierced through the armor he wore so effortlessly. Her name, he learned, was Latoya, a detail she offered reluctantly, as if parting with it cost her something precious. Her reaction to his presence had been visceral, a sharp flinch, as though his voice had sliced through the fragile silence she clung to. When he suggested taking her to a shelter, a place where she could find warmth and safety, her refusal was immediate, her voice quivering with a mix of fear and urgency. She begged him not to call the police, her words spilling out in a rush that betrayed the depth of her desperation. Her eyes, wide and glistening in the dim light of the park, held a paradox. A raw, unfiltered terror laced with a flicker of defiance that seemed to anchor her against collapse. Braylen, unaccustomed to being swayed by emotion, found himself silenced by the intensity of her gaze. Questions burned in his mind. What had driven her to this state? What threat loomed so large that she feared even the authorities? But he held them back, sensing that probing would only deepen her distress. Instead of pressing her, Braylen acted on an impulse he barely understood. He offered to take her somewhere safe, a place where she could rest without fear of being found. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the frayed edges of her jacket, but eventually nodded. Her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were weighing the risks of trusting a stranger. Braylen led her to his sleek black car, parked discreetly at the edge of the park, its polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the street lamps. The drive to Brooklyn was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space where words might have been. Latoya sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her hands folded protectively over her swollen belly, her eyes fixed on the passing city lights. Braylen stole glances at her, noting the way her shoulders remained tense, her breath shallow, as though she were bracing for an unseen blow. He chose a small, unassuming hotel in a quiet corner of the borough, a place far removed from the glittering high-rises of Manhattan. The lobby was modest but clean, its faded wallpaper and worn furniture exuding a kind of understated comfort. Braylen paid for a room for 3 nights, handing over his credit card without hesitation, though he could feel the desk clerk's curious stare. He asked for discretion, slipping an extra bill to ensure it, and the clerk nodded, unfazed by the request. When they reached the room, Latoya stepped inside cautiously, her bare feet padding softly against the worn carpet. The space was simple. A narrow bed with crisp white sheets, a small wooden desk, a single window overlooking a dimly lit street. Braylen watched as she took it all in, her expression unreadable but her posture still guarded. He handed her a business card, its embossed letters gleaming under the fluorescent light, and told her to call if she needed anything. The gesture felt inadequate, a flimsy bridge between his world and hers. but it was all he could offer without crossing a line he wasn't ready to breach. Latoya took the card, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment, and nodded once, her lips pressed into a tight line. There was no promise in her gesture, no assurance that she would reach out, only a quiet acknowledgement of his effort. Braylen left her there, closing the door softly behind him, and drove back to his penthouse, the city's lights blurring into streaks as his mind replayed the encounter. The next morning, Braylen returned to the hotel, driven by a nagging sense of responsibility he couldn't shake. The clerk informed him that the woman had left before dawn, her room left in pristine condition. Braylen stepped inside, finding the bed neatly made, the pillows fluffed, and the desk bare, except for his business card, placed precisely at its center. The sight of it sent a pang through him, a mix of frustration and unease. Latoya was gone, leaving no trace beyond the card and the lingering weight of her presence. Braylen pocketed it, his fingers tracing the embossed letters as he walked back to his car. That evening, as he sat in his sleek, modern office, the city skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, he opened his tablet to skim the news. His routine was methodical. Check markets, scan headlines, monitor the pulse of the world that fueled his wealth. But a single headline stopped him cold. A woman had vanished, the article claimed, a surrogate mother carrying a child for a prominent political family. The authorities suspected foul play, possibly a kidnapping. The accompanying photo was grainy, likely pulled from a security camera, but Braylen recognized her instantly. The curve of her jaw, the slope of her shoulders. It was Latoya. His heart thudded as the pieces began to connect, each one pulling him deeper into a mystery he hadn't asked to unravel. The news of the missing woman lingered in Braylen's mind like a shadow that refused to fade. He was not a man given to sentiment, his life governed by the cold logic of numbers and contracts, yet something about Latoya's story had taken root, unsettling him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The grainy image from the news article, her face partially obscured but unmistakably hers, replayed in his thoughts as he sat in his sleek Manhattan office, the city's skyline a glittering backdrop beyond the expansive windows. The weight of her absence, the unanswered questions about her fear and flight, gnawed at him. Braylen was no stranger to wielding power, and he knew how to get answers. He summoned his legal team, a group of sharp-minded attorneys accustomed to navigating the murky waters of high-stakes investigations. His instructions were clear. Find out everything about the woman from the park, no matter how deeply buried the truth might be. The team, well-versed in discretion, set to work without hesitation, their efficiency a testament to the resources at Braylen's disposal. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last as Braylen waited for answers. He went through the motions of his daily routine, meetings with investors, calls with overseas partners, but his focus drifted, pulled back to the memory of Latoya's trembling hands and the urgency in her eyes. The park encounter, brief as it was, had left an imprint, a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. When his lead attorney finally returned with a preliminary report, Braylen cleared his schedule and met the team in a private conference room, its walls lined with dark wood and soundproof to ensure secrecy. The findings, presented in a series of documents and hushed summaries, were more unsettling than he had anticipated. Latoya was not merely a surrogate mother, as the news had claimed. She was the younger sister of the wife of a prominent politician, a man whose name carried weight in Washington, and whose family's family had cultivated an image of untouchable respectability for decades. The couple's public persona was polished to perfection, their charity galas and political endorsements a fixture in the media. But beneath the surface, the report revealed a darker reality. The contract Latoya had signed, agreeing to carry a child as a surrogate, was not a voluntary arrangement. The documents, meticulously uncovered by Braylen's team, showed inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, signatures that appeared rushed, and clauses buried in fine print that suggested coercion. Latoya had been pressured into the agreement, her compliance secured through means that were not explicitly detailed, but hinted at intimidation and manipulation. The most staggering revelation came next. The child she carried was not genetically linked to the politician or his wife. It was Latoya's own, conceived through a process that had been deliberately misrepresented to her. The implications settled over Braylen like a cold fog. The politician and his wife had intended to claim the child as their own, erasing Latoya's role entirely. The contract, the attorneys noted, included provisions that ensured her silence, her disappearance from the narrative once the child was born. The word erased hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with meaning. It wasn't just about taking the child, it was about removing Latoya from existence, whether through legal maneuvering or something more sinister. Braylen leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he processed the information. The conference room was silent, the attorneys waiting for his response, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in the park when Latoya had begged him not to call the police. Her fear, so raw and immediate, now made sense. She had fled not just from a contract, but from a carefully orchestrated plan that threatened her very identity. The realization hit him with a clarity that was both unsettling and galvanizing. She had run because she understood the stakes, because she refused to let herself be erased. Braylen's team had traced her last known movements to the hotel in Brooklyn, but beyond that, her trail was cold. She was hiding, moving like a ghost through a world that seemed determined to forget her. And yet, Braylen was the only one who knew where she had been, the only one who had seen her vulnerability and her resolve in equal measure. The memory of her eyes, desperate yet unyielding, returned to him, vivid and sharp. He had seen determination before, in boardrooms and negotiations, but this was different. It was not ambition or greed, but survival, a quiet strength that had kept her upright on that park bench, despite the weight of her circumstances. Braylen felt a shift within himself, a stirring of something he hadn't acknowledged in years, a sense of duty, not to his empire or his legacy, but to a stranger whose life had collided with his own. He couldn't walk away, not now, knowing what he did. The politician's family, with their pristine reputation and carefully curated power, had underestimated Latoya's will to fight. And now Braylen found himself drawn into her battle. The conference room remained quiet as he stood, his decision made. He would not let her disappear. The truth, now partially uncovered, was a thread he intended to follow, no matter where it led. Braylen moved with a precision honed by years of navigating high-stakes deals, but this time his objective was not profit or power. It was a woman whose life hung in the balance. The revelations about Latoya's predicament had ignited a sense of urgency within him, a drive to act before the forces pursuing her could close in. His vast network of contacts, cultivated over decades in the upper echelons of business, became his greatest asset. He reached out to private investigators, discreet operatives who operated in the shadows of the city, tasking them with finding Latoya without drawing attention. Within days, they traced her to a rundown motel on the outskirts of New Jersey, a place where the neon sign flickered intermittently and the parking lot was littered with cracked asphalt and forgotten dreams. Latoya had been meticulous, paying in cash and avoiding any digital footprint. No credit cards, no phone calls, no trace that could lead back to her. The motel, with its peeling paint and sagging curtains, was the kind of place where people went to disappear, and Latoya had chosen it for exactly that reason. When Braylen arrived at the motel, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot, painting the scene in hues of gold and gray. He found her in a corner room on the second floor, the door slightly ajar as if she were ready to flee at a moment's notice. Latoya looked more worn than she had in Centralny Park, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her frame weighed down by the strain of constant vigilance. Yet, beneath the fatigue, her resolve remained unbroken, a quiet strength that seemed to hold her together like a thread through fragile fabric. She stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the thin, faded curtains, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Braylen stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and took in the sparse surroundings. A sagging bed with a threadbare comforter, a chipped nightstand holding a single glass of water, and a small duffel bag that contained what little she had carried into this temporary refuge. The air smelled faintly of mildew and cheap cleaning products, a stark contrast to the polished world Braylen inhabited. Latoya's story, pieced together from the fragments she shared, was one of betrayal and survival. Her sister, swayed by the ambitions of her powerful husband, had coerced Latoya into a surrogacy agreement, leveraging secrets from her past to ensure compliance. The threats had been subtle at first, veiled in familial obligation, but they grew sharper as Latoya began to question the arrangement. When she discovered the child she carried was her own, not a product of her sister's design, the truth had shattered her. The realization that her sister and brother-in-law intended to claim the child and erase her from their lives, possibly through means far darker than legal maneuvering, had driven her to flee. She had run with nothing but the clothes on her back, her instincts guiding her to the anonymity of the park where Braylen had found her. Her words, though sparse, carried the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss and chosen to fight rather than fall. Braylen listened, his face impassive but his mind racing. He was no stranger to power plays, to the ruthless calculations of those who sought to control others, but this was different. This was personal, a betrayal woven into the fabric of family, and it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, a sense of outrage, tempered by a determination to act. Money, which had always been his primary tool, was only a partial solution here. Latoya needed more than a payout. She needed freedom, a chance to reclaim her life and protect the child she carried. Braylen's resources, however, gave him the means to make that possible. He contacted a network of discreet operatives, individuals who specialized in creating new identities for those who needed to vanish. Through encrypted channels, he arranged for forged documents, a new passport, a driver's license, a birth certificate, all under a name that would sever Latoya's ties to her past. Canada became the destination, a country close enough to be reachable, but far enough to offer sanctuary. He secured a team of lawyers in Toronto, specialists in immigration and family law, who would be ready to defend her rights once she arrived. The logistics were complex, but executed with the efficiency Braylen demanded. He arranged for a private car to take Latoya to a small airfield outside the city, where a chartered plane waited to cross the border under the radar. Every step was designed to avoid detection. No commercial flights, no traceable transactions. Braylen provided her with cash, enough to sustain her for months, and a burner phone with a single number programmed into it, a lifeline to one of his trusted associates. As he handed her the duffel bag containing these essentials, Latoya's eyes met his, her expression a mix of gratitude and wariness. She didn't ask what came next, and Braylen didn't press her. He understood that her future was hers to shape, and his role was to give her the chance to do so. As she stepped into the car, her silhouette disappearing into the twilight, Braylen felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He had set her on a path to safety, but the weight of her story, and the forces still hunting her, remained a shadow he could not shake. As Latoya embarked on her journey to a new life, Braylen turned his attention to dismantling the web of deceit that had ensnared her. The truth about her coercion and the politician's family lingered in his mind, a puzzle that demanded resolution. He summoned his team of lawyers and private investigators, a group whose loyalty and discretion had been proven through years of handling his most sensitive affairs. Seated in the sterile conference room of his Manhattan office, Braylen issued a directive that was both clear and uncompromising. Uncover every detail of the scheme that had trapped Latoya, no matter how deeply buried or protected. His team, accustomed to navigating the underbelly of power, set to work with methodical precision. They combed through financial records, traced encrypted communications, and unearthed the documents that had been carefully concealed. Over the course of weeks, a damning picture emerged. The surrogacy contract Latoya had signed was riddled with irregularities. Forged signatures, backdated clauses, and payments funneled through offshore accounts to obscure their origins. Recordings surfaced, obtained through means Braylen chose not to question, capturing veiled threats made to Latoya, her sister's voice laced with a chilling blend of authority and desperation. The financial trails led directly to the politician's family, exposing a network of intermediaries who had facilitated the arrangement with clinical efficiency. Braylen, whose life had been defined by calculated risks, knew the next step would carry consequences far beyond his usual sphere of influence. He contacted a journalist, a seasoned investigative reporter known for exposing corruption among the elite. The handoff was anonymous, conducted through a secure drop point in a nondescript diner on the edge of the city. Braylen provided a dossier, hundreds of pages of meticulously gathered evidence, from contracts to bank statements to audio files. He included no note, no signature, only the raw materials of truth. He understood the weight of what he was unleashing. A story of this magnitude would ripple through the corridors of power, shaking foundations that had stood unchallenged for years. When the story broke, it did so with the force of a tidal wave. Headlines dominated every major outlet, their words searing. Corruption, coercion, a political dynasty implicated in a scheme to exploit a vulnerable woman. The public devoured the details, their outrage fueled by the betrayal of a family they had once admired. The politician's carefully curated image crumbled, replaced by images of protests outside his offices and calls for investigations that echoed across social media. As the story gained traction, Braylen's involvement remained a closely guarded secret, until it wasn't. A leak, perhaps from a rival seeking to destabilize him, tied his name to the expose. The revelation sent shockwaves through his world. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from panicked investors, their voices replaced by curt emails as partnerships dissolved. Stock prices for his companies plummeted, the graphs on his office screens painting a stark picture of financial hemorrhage. The social circles he had once navigated with ease turned cold. Invitations to galas and private dinners dried up, replaced by whispers of betrayal among the elite who had once courted his favor. The media, hungry for a new angle, painted him as a reckless crusader, a billionaire who had turned on his own kind. Editorials questioned his motives, some accusing him of seeking publicity, others suggesting darker, ulterior agendas. Braylen read the headlines from his penthouse, the city's lights sprawling below, and felt the weight of his choices settle over him like a second skin. Yet, amidst the chaos, Braylen found an unexpected clarity. The empire he had built, with its gleaming towers and billion-dollar deals, had always been a monument to his control, his ability to bend the world to his will. But this act of exposing the truth felt different. It was not about power or profit, but about something more elusive, something he had glimpsed in Latoya's eyes that night in the park. He thought of her now, safe in a distant country, her child free from the grasp of those who would have claimed it. The image steadied him, a quiet anchor in the storm of his unraveling reputation. For the first time in his life, Braylen felt a sense of purpose that transcended the balance sheets and boardrooms that had defined him. The cost was undeniable. His name, once a synonym for untouchable success, was now tainted, his alliances fractured. But as he stood alone in his office, the city's pulse thrumming beyond the glass, he felt no regret. The freedom he had helped secure for Latoya, the chance for her to raise her child without fear, was a victory that no stock ticker could measure. It was, he realized, a kind of freedom he had never known himself. Months had passed since the storm of the expose, and Braylen stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, gazing out at the constellation of lights that defined the city's skyline. The view, once a symbol of his dominion, now felt like a distant echo of a life he no longer fully recognized. His empire, though still generating wealth, had lost its polished sheen. Boardrooms that once buzzed with deference now held guarded glances. Deals that had flowed effortlessly were now met with hesitation. The social circles that had celebrated him as a titan had cast him out, their whispers of betrayal lingering like a faint hum in the air. Braylen, who had thrived on the adoration of the elite, found himself an outcast in the very world he had shaped. Yet, in the solitude of his new reality, there was an unexpected lightness, a sense of release that he hadn't anticipated. The weight of expectations, of maintaining an untarnished image, had lifted, leaving behind a clarity he hadn't known he craved. One quiet afternoon, as the autumn light filtered through the penthouse's glass walls, a letter arrived. It was unremarkable in appearance, a plain envelope, no return address, delivered by a courier who vanished as quickly as he appeared. The handwriting on the page was neat but unadorned, the ink slightly smudged as though written in haste. Braylen knew instantly who had sent it, though no name was signed. Latoya's words filled the pages, each sentence a glimpse into a life rebuilt from the ashes of her past. She wrote of a small town in Canada, nestled among rolling hills and quiet lakes, where the air carried the scent of pine and the days moved at a gentler pace. She described her new home, a modest apartment with creaking floors and windows that let in the morning sun. She wrote of her child, now born, whose first smile had brought a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The letter spoke of small victories, learning to trust the kindness of strangers, finding work at a local library, planting a tiny garden that bloomed despite the short growing season. Each word carried a quiet resilience, a testament to her determination to carve out a future free from fear. Braylen read the letter slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as he absorbed every detail. He pictured Latoya in this faraway town, her days no longer shadowed by the threat of erasure. The image of her child, described with a mother's tenderness, stirred something deep within him, a sense of connection to a life he had helped preserve. He read the letter again, then a third time, each pass easing the burden of the months that had followed his decision to expose the truth. The fallout had been relentless. The plummeting stocks, the severed partnerships, the cold shoulders from those he had once called allies. Yet as he held the letter, those losses seemed to shrink, their significance dwarfed by the weight of what he had gained. Latoya's words were not effusive with gratitude. They were measured, deliberate, as though she, too, was navigating the delicate balance of trust. But their simplicity carried a power that no public accolade could match. They were proof that his actions, however costly, had mattered. The penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. Braylen folded the letter carefully, tucking it into a drawer where he kept only the essentials, a stark contrast to the cluttered opulence of his former life. He returned to the window, his reflection faint against the glass, the city sprawling endlessly before him. The Manhattan he had known, with its glittering promises and ruthless ambitions, seemed less imposing now. The lights, once a testament to his conquests, felt softer, their glow less a challenge than a quiet invitation to see the world anew. Braylen's thoughts drifted to the choices that had led him here, to the moment in the park when he had paused, to the decision to act when every instinct urged him to walk away. He had spent his life chasing permanence, wealth, status, control. But now he understood that some decisions carried a value that transcended all of that. The letter, with its unassuming words, was a reminder that he had given Latoya the chance to live, to love, to build a life untainted by the shadows of her past. In doing so, he had found something of his own, a sense of purpose that no amount of money or reputation could buy. The city stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, but for the first time it felt less like a battleground and more like a place where redemption was possible.